Hey guys, Tim here from Tim's Turf Talk, bringing you another video full of useful information geared towards homeowners that are interested in taking care of Bermuda turf themselves. I've collected a lot of information over the years, so we've created this video collection for you guys to help you guys work through the process. I've learned quite a bit over the years, so I hope you enjoy the content. I look forward to it, and we'll see you guys in a minute. Welcome to our final video in our series where we start talking about proper irrigation techniques. So far we've talked about pre-emergent and post-emergent weed control. We've talked about proper mowing techniques, proper feeding techniques, and now the final topic, proper irrigation techniques. I kept this video for last because irrigation is important, but it's not as critical as proper mowing and proper feeding. And there's not really a lot of catastrophic things that can happen if you don't irrigate properly. But it is still a topic I wanted to talk about because we can cause ourselves some additional work if we do some stuff wrong when it comes to irrigation. We're going to talk about what happens when you under-irrigate your turf in a few minutes, but let's start off by talking about what happens when you overwater your turf. Now, I know a lot of homeowners like to have the sprinklers running every single day. It makes them feel like they're doing something to contribute positively towards the overall health of their turf. Well, this actually causes us a pretty big problem in the long run because when we're watering our turf frequently, we always have a generous supply of water in the turf, and so the turf never creates this dense root structure that drives deep into the soil to keep itself alive when we have a drought situation. The turf stays very, very shallow because there's always a water supply there. So what ends up happening is you get into a situation where you have a mild to moderate drought situation. Your turf begins to dry out very quickly because it's shallow, and therefore you have to supplement with additional water more frequently than somebody that doesn't water their turf a lot, because when you don't water your turf a lot, you get the exact opposite situation. The plant wants to survive, it's Mother Nature, and so it's going to find water any way it can, so therefore it's going to start sending its roots very, very deeply into the soil where the moisture remains and doesn't dry out quite as quickly. So you're creating a situation where the less you water your turf, the more drought resistant it becomes over time. So how do I know if I'm overwatering my turf or underwatering my turf? Well, like I said a few minutes ago, there are some telltale signs of when you're underwatering your turf. And if you're overwatering your turf, it's not really that easy to tell because you're not underground, you can't see the root structure. So we need to have a set of measurements in place to keep us within a certain range. Typically speaking, Bermuda likes to receive about 1 inch of rainfall or precipitation or augmented water per week, 1 inch per week. So if you're in a situation where Mother Nature hasn't helped you out at all and you haven't had any rain for 3 or 4 days, you might start to see some signs of heat stress. Here, let me show you a picture of what heat stress looks like so you can keep an eye out for it so you know when it's time to water. In this picture, you'll see that it's circled that off to the side here, there's a gray section of the turf. This gray section is where the heat stress is occurring in the turf. It's actually sending you a telltale sign that, hey, I need water, please give me some water. There's actually another sign that your turf will give you when it needs water, and that becomes in the shape of your footprints in the turf. If you walk across your yard and you turn back around and you can see the footprints, the places that you've been in the turf, it's not springing back quickly. That's another great sign that, hey, I might need some water. Typically, you'll see your heat stress areas pop up around sidewalks, driveways. In my situation, I've got a retaining wall in the front yard. And so what happens is the soil near those big concrete structures heats up quicker because not only is it getting baked from the sun itself, but you also have this massive porous concrete that's pulling moisture out. So the soil there dries out very, very quickly, and you'll often see the signs of heat stress there sooner than you will just in the center of your yard where it's nice and dense and moist all the way around it. So keep an eye out around your hot spots, and when you start to see a hot spot turn a little bit gray, you're in the very beginning, early stages of heat stress, and that's when you need to supplement water. 1 inch of water is basically what it needs on a weekly basis. It doesn't have to be a calendar week. It doesn't have to be Sunday to Sunday. If you don't get an inch in that 7 days, panic and throw water on it. I recommend people to just keep an eye out for heat stress. And they see the heat stress, add water to the turf, because if you're back to this point I made a few minutes ago where if you water it rarely, you're actually creating a more drought resistant and healthier turf overall because the plant is wanting to survive itself. Another benefit of having a really dense root structure that's really deep into the soil is that the soil actually holds more water than it would if there was not a root structure there. Think about a plant that you have in your house, for example. When you go on vacation for a week and you come back and you go add a few ounces of water to that plant. Well, sometimes that water will run straight through and collect like in a dish at the bottom, and you're like, what in the world? I only added 4 ounces of water to this big pot. How is it possibly running out of the bottom? Well, that's because the soil's gotten so dense and so packed in some areas that the water takes the path of least resistance and simply channels through and skips most of the actual soil in that pot. So then you water it again and again and again and again, and eventually the soil becomes all the way dense, loosens up a little bit, you get a nice root structure, and then it actually holds more water than it did when it was completely dry. And this is the same with your turf. If your turf is nice dense root structure and you get a 1/4 inch rain shower or a 1/10 of an inch rain shower, if that soil is dense enough with root structure, you'll actually retain that water. If the soil is so dense from not having a root structure, you'll get a lot of water runoff, you'll absorb very little of it, and you actually wash away a lot of your chemicals that you may have just applied a few days before, a fertilizer. They start running off with all this water that's running off the soil. So you want the soil to absorb the moisture, and it does that by having a dense root structure, which you get from not watering your turf as frequently, if that makes sense. So now you're at the point where you've got this nice root structure, you know what to keep an eye out with when it comes to heat stress. So now let's take a situation where we haven't had rain for 4 or 5 days, and you look at the forecast and man, it doesn't look like there's any rain coming in the next week or so. So what do? Go ahead and maybe put a little bit of water down on the soil, get ahead of it, give it a few more days, maybe you get a random shower, maybe you don't, keep an eye out for heat stress, and you it's kind of like a living, breathing situation where you just kind of go with the flow and kind of look in the future and figure out if you're going to need to supplement or not. So now let's talk about what happens. Say it's been 3 or 4 days, you've had no rain, you look at the future, and there's no rain coming at all, and you give it a 1/10 of an inch of rain, of water from your sprinklers, maybe a 1/4 inch, and time is going by, and it's just getting drier and drier and drier, and you want to go ahead and give a nice, healthy watering to your turf because you want to go ahead and give it that extra energy, that extra power to sustain and keep growing roots deeper and deeper and deeper. So you want to go add water to your soil. Well, how much do you need to add? Let's say we're going to add a 1/2 inch of water to the soil, but how do you know when it's actually 1/2 inch? Because that's an interesting question. If you have a sprinkler out there and it runs for 10 minutes, well, how much water did you actually put down? You need to be able to measure it. And I have a great solution, and it's dirt cheap. And that comes in the form of a tuna fish can, cat food can, any type of can that's round and has an inch or so lip on it, because what you can do is you can take 6, 7, 8 of those, put them sporadically throughout the yard, wherever you want to put them, wherever your sprinkler pattern goes across, and then you can collect water. And so what you can do is you can run your sprinkler for, let's say, 15 minutes, and then you go out there and you check to see how much water is in that can. If you have a 1/4 inch of water in that can in 15 minutes, then you would know that that sprinkler head running on that pattern would produce an inch of rain or water in an hour. You're not going to get that much water, I don't think, out of a sprinkler, but I want to just keep those numbers kind of easy to calculate. So what you want to do is just run your sprinklers as a test pattern a few times and understand that pattern this, pattern that, sprinkler this, sprinkler that, I get 1/10 of an inch of water every half hour, or whatever it may be, and then you can start doing the calculations and understand that, okay, I've had a 1/2 inch of rain over the past week or so, starting to see some heat stress here, I want to supplement some water, let me go run the sprinklers for 30 minutes, therefore I know I've added the other 1/2 inch of water, or whatever it is that your situation is. So those tuna fish cans or catfish cans in your yard is a really good gauge on how to figure out how much water you're applying when you're running the sprinklers. So what I do in my situation is, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, I just kind of go with the flow a little bit. I don't I don't write down exactly the amount of water that I see coming in from Mother Nature, and I don't necessarily supplement every single time I need to, because I want my turf to take care of itself. As a matter of fact, last year, I did not supplement water a single time. There were a few times I had some hot spots pop up where I had some drought going, and that was along my retaining wall. And I also, which brings up another cool point, is I had a couple spots inside of my yard that were not near anything concrete. And I was like, why is this particular area suffering from heat stress? And I actually ended up losing, I don't know, a 2 or 3 square foot chunk of my turf to heat stress. And I was like, what is going on here? This is just a random spot in my yard. Well, my house was built in 2010, and of course it was built by a big contracting company that they built hundreds and hundreds of houses. And there was actually some construction debris under the sod. Because when they come in and lay the sod, they just quickly throw it down, they kick it in place, and they move on. They don't care if there's stuff under the dirt. They've got these big tractors that flatten the soil out, throw sod on, hey, move on to the next house. Win, 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 go, 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 go. So I actually had to dig up the sod, or at this point in time, it's no longer sod, it's just my turf. Dig up the turf, and then underneath there I found big chunks of concrete. The moment I pulled that concrete out, I then filled it back with some nice soil. The turf grew back over that, and then that heat stress cause of that dry concrete in there actually went away, and now that soil retains water just like all the other parts of my yard do. So now I've fixed that situation. So it's this really, really common along the side of driveways where they've come in and they've poured the concrete for the driveway and they scrape off the extra there on the side, and then they fill back over it with the dirt and then the sod. So you'll see heat stress along driveways because, one, like I mentioned a minute ago, driveways pull heat, they hold heat, they pull water out, and often there's debris underneath the turf that needs to be pulled out. So don't worry about it if you see that, or you see a big chunk on the side where it's just always dry and hard as a rock. Take a screwdriver. If you can drive a screwdriver through it, okay, maybe there's something else going on there, but the chances are you will not get a screwdriver through that turf because it's so dense, and there may only be an inch of sod there, and right underneath of it, hard concrete. So, a nice 4, 5, 6 inch long screwdriver into the soil, you start hitting a lot of hard stuff, there's something under there. So go ahead, tear the turf apart, pull that debris out of there, fill it back in, and then you fix the problem there, and then that no longer becomes an irrigation challenge, it just becomes part of your regular yard. So now we've talked about what happens when you overwater your turf. You create that situation where the root structure is very, very shallow and it dries out very, very quickly, and you see the signs of heat stress sooner than you would if you had a deep root structure. We've talked about what the heat stress looks like, which is it typically starts with the turf turning a little bit gray, then darker gray, darker, and then eventually turns brown and dies off. And we've talked about also what it would look like when you start to see the heat stress in the shape of footprints in your turf. If you see footprints not springing back, you need to add some water. We've talked about how to figure out how much water you're actually putting down on the soil with your sprinklers using the tuna fish cans or the catfish cans. And we've talked about just keeping an eye on the weather and supplementing water only when you need to and not just always watering your turf. And the last important part that I want to talk about is when you water the turf. The biggest mistake a homeowner can make when it comes to irrigating their turf is irrigating at night or late in the evening or in the afternoon. The reason that these are bad times to do it, each one of them has its own negative. If you were to water in the afternoon when the sun is out, you're actually applying moisture to the turf. When the sun's baking, that water's evaporating and you're steaming your turf. If you were to irrigate in the evening hours, which most homeowners do the evening hours because that's when they come home from work and they go out there and set the sprinklers, what happens is you end up having a very, very moist soil all night long, and it's just a damp environment. And if Bermuda wasn't so resistant to disease, you actually have a really great environment there to produce fungus and disease that's wet all night long. What happens when you irrigate early in the morning, an hour and a half to 2 hours before the sun rises, you get a nice moist soil, and then as the sun starts to come up, all that water slowly, like the morning dew, evaporates off slowly, the temperatures start to climb up, the soil surface starts to dry a little bit, and by the time you get into that massive heat part of the day, the top of the soil is dry, you have no water that's steaming your turf, and that moisture is nice down into the soil, so you're sustaining your turf throughout the heat of the day. So early morning watering is by far the best time, and the worst time is about 8 o'clock at night, and that's when most people do it. So try to keep that in mind. I know nobody wants to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to water their turf. So I would recommend checking out one of the local hardware stores. A lot of them will have timers that you just put on your hose bib and set it for 4 a.m. and then let it run for half an hour, whatever it may be. So there are ways to get around that early morning watering, but you definitely want to adhere to that 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. watering time if you can. If you can't and you have to water in the afternoon or early evening, just keep an eye out for funguses and diseases and stuff like that. You shouldn't see anything with Bermuda, but it is something that I wanted to point out, that this is probably the area where homeowners make some of the biggest mistakes, and that's watering at the wrong time. So in conclusion, we've talked about the signs of heat stress. We've talked about the areas that often experience heat stress first. We've talked about some of the negatives of overwatering your soil. We've talked about some of the positives of underwatering your soil. We've talked about the general guidelines of 1 inch of precipitation or irrigation per week. We've talked about ways of gauging that through aluminum cans in your yard and measuring the amount of water that gets outputted by your sprinklers in the half hour to an hour, whatever it may be. Trying to stay ahead of Mother Nature a little bit, anticipating what you're going to experience over the next week. And it's much easier to introduce a drought situation under controlled circumstances, because creating that drought situation is what creates the deep root structure. So it's much easier for a homeowner to purposefully create a drought and send that root structure deep than it is to have Mother Nature give you a drought and your turf not be prepared for it. So do it under a controlled situation where you know that over the next week I'm going to kind of dry out my soil a little bit. I'm not going to let it go too crazy. I'm not going to let my turf start dying off, but I am going to take this week and let my root structure get deep, and then supplement a little bit of water if you see that heat stress, and then create that situation where you're creating more and more dense, deeper root structure through an induced drought under controlled circumstances, if that makes sense. I hope you guys have enjoyed this series. I hope you have found it to be helpful and informative. I've really enjoyed making this series, and I'm looking forward to starting the next set of videos where we start getting into the more intermediate topics, where we start talking about top dressing and micros and macros and a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more nerdy type of stuff. The next set of videos is going to probably be on hold for a few weeks because it's late February and the turf here starts to come out of dormancy right around late March, early April, depending on the spring that we're going to have. And that's when I'm really going to start firing up the videos in like a real-time format, where we do the spring scalp, which we'll need to do here probably around April 1st, April 15th, that type of thing. I'll do the video on the spring scalp. And as the turf's coming out of dormancy and all the different aspects of taking care of the turf pop up in my real world situation, I'm going to do a video on them. And so hopefully if you follow along at home and you experience a lot of these same challenges or situations, the videos should follow the natural curve of the life cycle through early spring, the blasting hot summer, and then finally back into the close to dormancy where we're shutting the turf down for the season again. So I'll see you guys over there in that video. I hope you've had fun, and remember, yes, your grass can be greener.